Welcome, everyone. My name is Joe Dresden, and I am a Senior Program Associate at the Kennan Institute here at the Wilson Center. I want to thank you all for joining us for a very special conversation today on the future of managing crisis and competition between the U.S. and Russia. I'd like to thank the Department of World Languages and Cultures at Howard University for co-sponsoring today's event, which is presented as part of the Kennan Institute's Black History Month programming. I encourage you to stay up to date on the latest Kennan Institute events and publications by visiting our website and subscribing to our two blogs, Focus Ukraine and The Russia File, as well as our podcasts, Kennan X and The Russia File. Please do also follow us on social media. We are at Kennan Institute on Twitter, and you can find the Kennan Institute on Facebook as well. Please also visit our Hindsight Upfront collection on the Wilson website for the latest news and analysis focused on the current unfolding crisis in Ukraine. Just Google Hindsight Upfront Ukraine, and it will take you there. For today's event, if you'd like to ask a question, please submit it via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page at any time during the presentation. Please do include your name and affiliation when sending in questions. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Gregory Hall. Greg Hall is an associate professor at the Earl F. and Jean M. Lockwood. He's the Earl F. and Jean M. Lockwood Professor of International Commerce and Entrepreneurship at the Patterson School of Democracy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. So a lot of sponsors and the donors, we have to get all of that correct. So sorry for struggling with that. Dr. Hall teaches courses on foreign policy, transnational organizations, and global South affairs. He was a Fulbright Fellow to Russia in Kazan, 1997, and has held appointments in Hong Kong and Turkey. He is also the author of Authority, Ascendancy, and Supremacy, China, Russia, and the United States' Pursuit of Relevancy and Power. And his forthcoming book is a follow-up study of that 2014 project, examining the interrelations between the three major great powers. I'm now pleased to turn the floor over to you, Dr. Hall, and I look forward to your comments today.
Thank you very much, Joe. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Joe and Eleanor and the Wilson Center and Kennan Institute colleagues for this opportunity to speak with you. Suffice it to say, these are really vibrant times, and it feels like that we're on a roller coaster sometime. And I would also like to acknowledge the people who come before me, mentors, teachers, and soldiers for peace and stability. I am a proud graduate of Howard University, received both my doctoral and master's degrees there, and I'm thankful to mentors like the late Nicolae Stavro, teachers like Walter Hill, Ron Walters, and colleagues like Dr. D. Fabrice, who are soldiering on, teaching Russian, exploring the wider world, if you will. So definitely want to acknowledge those who came before me, and obviously the giants like Dr. Ralph Bunch, and of course people like Donald McHenry. All kinds of people everywhere are quite interested in international affairs and have been for a long time. Obviously, this isn't, if you will, a happy or feel-good occasion. And as I reflect and have prepared for this conversation this afternoon, I don't think I have what could be called a feel-good message. This iteration of the Russia-Ukraine crisis is really an acute crisis. It's a dire emergency, and we can't fool ourselves there. This current round of the Russia-Ukraine crisis is unfolding in many ways predictably, but at the same time, we really don't know where this is going to end up. But clearly there's a sense of foreboding and that it's not moving in a good direction, obviously. The war is escalating. I called it recently a slow rolling invasion. It's picking up, but it's almost a chess piece destabilization and a military campaign. So there are a lot of things going on at one time, a lot of movements in this orchestra, if you will. Sad to say, the Zelensky government probably will fall, and it will probably fall in relatively short order. one thing that's really been nagging at me in this current round of crisis, however, is what I consider to be many missed opportunities and even failures on the part of our leaders and our multilateral institutions to do a better job in the post-Cold War period. Principally, there's been a failure to establish a workable, a durable 21st century security mechanism or mechanisms for different regions and a global mechanism. And I think of President Zelensky's comments this past weekend to the Munich Security Conference. He was really pleading, it was very heartfelt, that the order doesn't work. And his country, a small country in terms of relative power, basically is on the chopping block. That was really an impassioned, a very emotional plea that he issued. And one has to wonder, where is the UN Security Council in a situation like this? Is there any utility? I'm not so sure. We have failed in the post-Cold War period to respect and bolster the so-called core principles, the principles of the UN Charter: sovereignty, self-determination, peaceful resolution of disputes, non-interference, etc. And there's failure and blame even to go around. And so I think of the ledger for the US and the West just between 1991 and 2011. And think about these: the botched breakup of the former Yugoslavia, Iraq, 2003, Kosovo's pull away from Serbia, and even Libya in 2011. But then there's the Russian ledger, and obviously there's Georgia in 2008, and Ukraine, Crimea, 2014 to the present time. And maybe coming soon even is Taiwan. And I agree with Robert Kagan that subduing Taiwan would enable China to really upend whatever strategic balance exists in East Asia at this time. We're just not getting right as a global community these situations, self-determination, interference, whatever, and that needs more attention. But returning to Ukraine, one has to appreciate this battle of perspectives that is at play. And I think of a few writings and speeches, documents recently that I believe give us a lot of insight into where Vladimir Putin's head is, and perhaps even where he and his colleagues are going in this particular situation. More people are citing these days the 2007 Munich Security Conference and Putin's speech. That's getting a lot more play. Putin's essay from July of last year on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, this whole triumph thing with Belarusia. And of course, the Putin-Xi joint statement of a few weeks ago at the start of the Beijing Olympics. I think that was really telling. And most recently, Putin's performance yesterday, very angry, pointed, but there are some strands that come, if you will, that come to the surface in these different speeches and pronouncements, if you will, and we have to consider basically what is being articulated. I think these give us insights. So, how could this happen? How did it happen? How did we get to this point where we're watching this invasion of a country? We watched the invasion of Kuwait back in fall 1990, and there was a response. There was a collective response. That's not going to happen here, and I think that's increasingly clear. And we need to grapple with that as a global community. But back to Ukraine, how could this not happen? As NATO was enlarging and taking a decision to enlarge in the late 1990s, we should have reckoned, we should have realized that that this is going to catch up with us one way or another. And maybe it was all meant to be in a way that, well, we must expand because one day Russia will go off the rails. But here we are. Then there's Russia's own attitude towards its neighborhood, if you will, and particularly the so-called near abroad or the inner empire. And so the big brotherly, bossy, even hegemonistic management of the neighborhood, exemplified by President Putin, is a huge part of this story. And of course, a history of intervention going all the way back, arguably, to Poland 1956, in either indirect or direct interventions. This has been the playbook, if you will. And then, of course, we ask, how could this not happen? It's a different animal, this China-Russia axis, that started forming or reforming in the 1990s, mid-1990s, but really has matured and hardened now. I'm even noticing more commentary, even here in the West, on this China-Russia axis. And it's interesting that Beijing stands with Moscow on NATO expansion, if not fully in agreement of Ukraine basically being swept away, and Moscow sides with Beijing on Taiwan. This is something very important to watch. So, deciphering President Putin and his imperatives since he has assumed power. And most of this is not hidden from us. And in fact, commentators like Masha Gessen has written about the Putin rise, ascension, how he looks at the world, how he looks at his face, and essentially what steps need to be taken or things need to be rectified. I'm convinced, colleagues, that what really drives Vladimir Putin is not to fail like his two predecessors, as he sees it, not to end up like Mikhail Gorbachev, who, in Putin's analysis and that of others, destroyed the country, and definitely not to end up like Boris Yeltsin, who humiliated the country. If China had its century of humiliation, I submit that for Russia, the 1990s were its decade of humiliation. And these sentiments come together in these various missives and pronouncements and speeches from Putin and from others, Foreign Minister Lavrov. There's a zeal here to be different than those two predecessors. And broadly, Putin has re-centralized political power in the Kremlin. It's been a step-by-step. The Russian Federation was established as a federation, but strategically over time, less power, less independence in the legislature, the two houses, particularly the Federation Council, and power literally centralized in the Kremlin. Putin sought to subdue the Caucasus, particularly, and quelling the Islamist challenge there, and generally restoring great power status. So, in line with Masha Gessen's future as history, future is history thesis, that's what I heard a lot of yesterday in Mr. Putin's speech, that greenlighting these two separatist regions in Ukraine essentially was establishing yet again that the future of the Russian space is history. The future is history. So then there is the new Biden administration and obviously the West, NATO, and the EU piece. This is really curious. And my, oh my, one wonders how will this aspect, this dynamic play out? I think Putin is learning some important lessons in this iteration of the Ukraine crisis. Biden is an experienced politician, and he's more hawkish or more prone to be hawkish than I think President Putin realized. And of course, that's a guesstimation, maybe wrong there. But this messaging war, this info war, which has challenges and possibly some dangers for a more democratic country to go down this path and to engage this way. Clearly, I give Biden an early advantage in this messaging war. It's been pretty interesting, and I think it has frustrated Putin on a few occasions recently. We'll see how this plays out. Clearly, things are moving quite rapidly. The Nord Stream 2 project has been basically set aside by the German government. I believe that the Kremlin was expecting that to happen. I question the extent to which sanctions will change planned behavior. Maybe Putin will take other moves that he might not have taken, but I'm not sure how much of a deterrent sanctions can or will be at this point. And that there's a calculation that the leadership and the elite can endure the certain pain to come. But there are implications to the sanctions. And I think a key thing here will be the extent to which China, the partner China, will stand by Russia and potentially risk the wrath of this sanctions regime, China being punished itself. This is, I think, something to watch here. And I'm even more concerned about how the US and the Western economies, extent to which we are prepared for the certain shocks to come out of the sanctions regime. Already, gas prices at the pump are reflecting this crisis, and we haven't even gotten into the worst of it to this point. That's something to be watched. Another interesting dynamic here is the U.S. domestic environment. And if you look back over the decades, then the good old bad days of the Cold War, there was bipartisanship in this country. You could count on it, and it's amazing how this iteration of crisis with Russia has become what's reflected in the country is partisan disunity. It's really shearing the political and social discord that's going on, and clearly it's something that can be that can be manipulated from the outside. That really stands out, and it's really amazing. People are going to be writing and talking about that, I believe, for a long time. As the sanctions set in, and as they are broadened, and they certainly will be, one wonders how the effects of these sanctions will interplay with the COVID effects, the economic effects of COVID that we're still dealing with globally, really. And so we wonder if there will be sort of larger, crises kind of evolving out of these different areas of economic financial crisis. And of course, the impacts on inflation and even price gouging. There's more reporting on that has been going on. Will we see more of this as the impacts of the sanctions against Russia and Russian elites really set in? So we, in this fast-moving drama, again, this slow-rolling invasion, occupation, dismantlement of at least a stable Ukraine, we wonder what's next. We wonder even if there are any deals to be made, if there's a basis for further diplomacy. I'm having quite a few conversations with students and colleagues in different places. Is there room? Is there necessity? Should there be continued diplomacy? And I have to say, as a teacher, where I want to, well, let me reflect on that. Let me get back to you. And I have to be very honest. I'm not sure. I honestly don't know at this point. I believe that Russia's declaration acknowledging the independence, so to speak, of these two breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine, that's been a game changer. Even the White House now calls it an invasion. An invasion is an invasion, no matter how you parse it. Is Minsk too relevant now? Probably not. Maybe elements, maybe ideas from it. What of the prospects for some kind of new NATO-Russia bargain? I think of the 1997 Founding Act, and I am still blown away at the lofty, friendly language in that Founding Act. Maybe we need to look back at that and just kind of reflect on that. But we're probably long past flowery words, something like the 97 Founding Act. But we need something. Robert Kagan and others that when Russia takes Ukraine, that NATO's eastern flank is seriously diminished. So it's hard to see what comes out of the situation is for the foreseeable future that stirs us and draws us towards more diplomacy, if you will. It's hard to see any glimmers of hope right now, except maybe to somehow cajole, discourage a fuller war, a full-blown war in Ukraine. Nonetheless, we all, and particularly the parties, have to prepare for the worst. And what does the worst look like? I think first that the whole of Ukraine becomes embroiled in violent conflict, more specifically the kind of intergroup conflict that the West was reintroduced to in the break of Yugoslavia in the early mid-1990s. Second, I think the Zelensky government falls. It's a matter probably of when and how. It was a big deal that he left the country this past weekend. Of course, that was against the Council of Allies. But suffice it to say, I don't see how his government stays in place. Another fear that many have and have been writing and talking about is an explosion of a refugee population, displaced people. And of course, that somehow this moves to a full invasion / occupation mode. And of course, the costs to Russia start mounting more and more. But I think that looking at the array of forces, the messaging that the Kremlin has accepted, the eventuality of some kind of full, Ukraine-wide military action. I think another sort of prepare for the worst dimension of it all aspect is that economic crisis engulfs not just the region, but begins to spread east and west, sort of beyond the region. Markets, we already see those impacts there, those fears, but will be spread beyond. And the last piece that I'd like to offer a few words on is something that my friend and colleague, Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, definitely would have addressed if she'd been able to participate in today's discussion. That is arms control and non-proliferation. So at the end of the day, it's interesting. And we like to compartmentalize things that, oh, well, this is this kind of conflict or that kind of conflict. Well, if you think about it, even a shouting match over Olympic scoring, if it involves two nuclear countries, that's a nuclear conflict, even if we don't call it that. This Russia-Ukraine crisis, folks, is a nuclear conflict, period. And those of us who have studied and practiced deterrence in these things, we may be introduced to some of these the debates on deterrence. How does a asymmetrical conflict become a full-blown conventional war? And worse, how does a conventional war, sort of evolve into a nuclear confrontation? We cannot discount the reality that dynamic that in the wings, this is a nuclear conflict, a confrontation between nuclear powers that we could be stumbling right into blindly. The world desperately needs US and Russia as the biggest possessors of nuclear weapons, and China, I would contend, to lead, to set an example, to at least have discussions and collaborations on arms control and non-proliferation. It's interesting, and just today, more of the talking heads and people looking at this are, well, what if Ukraine could have kept and obtained operational control over those weapons? This would probably be a very different situation in that regard. But I'm afraid that cooperation on arms control, already in jeopardy, is going to crash as a result of this conflict. And if that's not enough, we should not discount the timing of the nuclear drills that Russia, and it's reported that President Putin oversaw them this past weekend, and also tests of hypersonic weapons. And again, this is something, it's an area that China is really pushing forward in. We're not moving any closer towards a 21st century security mechanism for global security and for regional security. We're not moving any closer. And I think the question for the moment is perhaps, is the future of US-West-Russian relations, is the future consigned to history as well? And if we are trapped in history as we move into the future, what are the implications for the broader global affairs? Again, not a happy, feel-good message, but these are very frustrating times, and I'm not sure that we're drawing the lessons as the global community that can help us to avert being trapped in history and avert, what appears to be certain disaster for a large country that yet is a small power, and that's Ukraine. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Greg. These are wonderful insights and analysis, and very wide-ranging as well. We'll now turn to the Q&A portion of today's program. So a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, please do submit it via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page. And again, please a reminder to include your name and affiliation when sending in questions. So I'm going to go ahead and take advantage of being where I'm sitting in the moderator chair to ask at least a couple initial questions. And my first question is bringing it back to China. China is not exactly supportive of Russia's designs on Ukraine, at least in terms of invading its and diminishing its sovereignty or the threatened invasion. What, in your view, what should we make of the difference between China and Russia on this particular issue? How serious is it?
Sure. So that's obviously, it's a long-standing relationship that has had episodes, and maybe over time, back to the 1940s and 50s, this relationship has been on again, off again. Obviously, strong suspicions about each other, but a bigger concern in the behemoth to the west, United States. Correct, Joe. China is not squarely on the same page as Russia when it comes to the Ukraine issue or the Ukraine problem. It definitely was not on the same page with Russia back in 2008 and the Georgian crisis. Um, China wants to see, sovereignty, the sovereignty of other actors, and I believe this is just kind of built into China as it became a great power and very active on the global stage. And so, the sort of ham-fisted kind of taking over a country, kind of the way Saddam Hussein did with Kuwait in 1990. China's not going to go for this, but Russia helps China to stand against the U.S. It helps China with the military relationship maneuvers, with arms sales, and obviously with energy. So they need each other. And I submit that so long as Russia does Ukraine right, so to speak, and that is in the Chinese estimation, that China will stand with Russia. And of course, some China hawks believe that US and NATO kind of bogged down in Eastern Europe, bogged down with Ukraine, et cetera, that this is opportunity for China to move forward and be prepared for the eventual takeover or subjugation of Taiwan. But I believe, and I indicated as much recently in another forum, that that Russia wants to assure, President Putin wants to assure that as he moves on Ukraine, that China's going to be with him. And I think that communique, that joint communique that they issued, even wearing the same attire at these events, they were sending a message that we stand together. But there's always the concern on China's side that Russia could go too far or do this in a ham-fisted way. And maybe, for China, Taiwan, this is not even an issue of sovereign nation states.
Mm-hmm. So your work deals with the conflict, cooperation, and competition among Russia, China, and the United States. What does the current crisis in Ukraine do to your model, to your theory of understanding how these three nations interact with each other?
Yes, and it is a triangle, however unequal, and it functions. I believe that it's a feature of international politics, not a system. So I don't count it as tripolarity, as a sort of a system that's distinct from multipolarity or unipolarity, but it's a feature, and it's a driver, if you will, until such time that there is a major change in actors, or the nature, the kinds of actors that are at play on the world stage, maybe even multilateral entities, but not every. I call them the big three. Not every great power will be equally interested or equally staked in a particular situation. But in my model, I talk about so-called critical level, salient, and latent conflicts. And back in 2013-14, I classified Ukraine as a salient conflict situation. To be deemed critical, I determined that all three of the major players, the great powers, are somehow militarily engaged, but that obviously the latent can evolve, elevate to salient, critical, etc. And I believe we may be seeing the evolution, the escalation of the Ukraine situation to a critical conflict, particularly if there's some type of sort of military response from this side, from NATO, which so far we don't see. But that Russia and China work in strategic ways of calibrating messaging, cooperation, and responses to the U.S. side, if you will. And so I studied the different sides of the triangle and how they do coordinate and calibrate relations. There are some situations where this is more obvious than others.
Okay. We have a question from D. Walters, who asks and cites today's New York Times opinion piece by Tom Friedman, in which he quotes George Kennan's view on NATO expansion, very hostile to NATO expansion, hostile to the idea, calling it a tragic mistake. Do you think Kennan's been vindicated, or is this a crisis that would have happened either way? Ukraine, Russia would never tolerate full Ukrainian sovereignty if it meant splitting from Russia, whether or not NATO ever expanded to begin with.
I have this debate obviously all the time with my colleagues and students. It makes for a wonderful debate. Some of it's hindsight. That sure, that expanding NATO was the way to go. Because one day Russia would revert back to expansionist aggressive power. I'm pondering more an article that I published in 1999 and what I had to say towards the end of the piece about NATO expansion, just more sort of a caution or anything, and essentially that the post-Yeltsin leadership would not look kindly on this. And even Yeltsin himself in the mid-90s, he really started turning against this. And he was the one who installed a foreign minister, Yevgeny Primikov, who clearly turned Russia on a different path in terms of the foreign policy orientation. So I've always thought that NATO enlargement, and I get the Clinton approach, the Partnership for Peace, that it's really about pulling together and encouraging countries to follow democratization, the market economy. I get that. I get that the EU had sort of a companion approach, sort of phased integration and agreements. But when you look at the map, and we're showing lots of maps these days. It's what things looked like in the 90s before what they look like now. It just doesn't add up that the expansion of a military alliance would be welcomed by a country that had twice been attacked in the 20th century. That you had to do something different. Now, from the Russian side, their argument was OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, really should have been sort of the driver for a new security architecture for Europe. It's a tough thing, but I believe that we find ourselves where we are today, in part. How much in part, I don't know, but we find ourselves where we are today in part because of a decision to expand a military alliance, essentially to the borders of a great power or former great power. So maybe Kennan is partially vindicated here, but if we needed to expand it NATO, it needed to have some other things. And maybe do some other things. And I think that founding act should have been exercised more.
Okay. So a question from Jose Cervantes Fonseca, and I'm going to expand on his question. He asks, what consequences can Latin America anticipate from this crisis? I'll just expand it to globally. Where do you think this will have unintended or even foreseen consequences in other parts of the world?
Sure. Great question. So we talk about the strategic triangle and China discovering, basically discovering much of the world, particularly as it pushes forward this Belt and Road Initiative. So There are already people writing, examining this strategic triangle concept applied to different regions like Latin America, like parts of Africa, if you will. So the competition piece of the great powers, this is being played out in different parts of the world. Now, this present crisis, I think that the biggest concern to people everywhere, the biggest hit is, in many cases, it's going to be financial. It's going to be markets. It's going, we have shaky supply chains now. They're going to get even shakier. And what product does not have oil in it? Containers, etc. These are the kinds of aspects that are going to make this present iteration of the Ukraine crisis global, if you will. Despite what surveys and polls say, like for this country, that Americans, we want no parts of this. We don't want to be engaged directly militarily, but consumers, workers everywhere, people who need energy, particularly natural gas. These are going to be the impacts. And then there's this other piece of it all. Small powers. Ukraine, again, large landmass, but a small power. How does this dissuade actors who may ponder one day, I may need a nuke, a nuclear weapons capability, or I need to shore up my military budget by another 10-20%. We're not showing, and Russia has a lot of blame here for this situation, that we can slice off a country, and of course this is like the second or the ongoing time. Kuwait got out of it better back in 1990-91, and again, I go back to Zelensky's impassioned comments to the Munich conference this past weekend. Ukraine deserves better than what they're getting.
Okay. Yeah, if you haven't seen it, I would really recommend a video that's making its way on Twitter and probably other platforms. It's the representative to the United Nations from Kenya. And he delivered just an amazing address about the realities of dealing with borders foisted upon you that do not really reflect the linguistic and ethnic concentrations of people across territories and are split by borders. And the gentleman from Kenya pointed out, we either had to learn to live with these borders or plunge ourselves into war. And we decided to look at the future and integrate and cooperate and be more closely knit as nations rather than strive for an ethnic, perfect ethnic map, which is impossible to achieve, and especially in that war. So definitely would recommend that to our viewers and anybody who hasn't seen it yet. With that being said, I'd like to go back to the historical question. Basically, I think it's clear now that Putin is relying on a historical casus belli for invading Ukraine rather than the so-called NATO provocation. Because what is he yelling about most when he talks to his people? It's about the shared history of Ukraine and Russia and how these are one people that cannot be split and that Ukraine is not even a real country. What do you think about this use of history as a proximate cause for war? What do you think it might spell for this conflict and perhaps other conflicts to come?
It's a lightning rod. It's going to embolden and encourage others, and particularly when we are looking at intergroup conflicts or even intra-group conflicts. History always proves my side right. The grievances, if the grievances are based in history, how does one effectively argue or sway the other side? That again, Putin's essay on this sort of the oneness of Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarusians last year was really instructive. I mean, there's a lot of medieval history that Putin laid out there, and he plays and toys with history, obviously. But at a point, we have to get on, so to speak, and there is the sort of the business of governance, economy, administration, etc. But essentially, again, history for Vladimir Putin has to become the future, and I think that's where he's at, and it's very dangerous. And as someone who watched and studied the collapse, the implosion, and the explosion of Yugoslavia, I got quite a lesson in that. Putin's, I think, imperative is to establish a future that somehow atones for the mistakes, for the things that went awry in history, and ways he's stuck in history. Many of us in the West kind of discount this and write it off as someone who's just babbling and looking to justify his moves. But we shouldn't discount those or take those lightly, because we see time and time again how history drives these intergroup conflicts, especially. So it's very troubling. And of course, how do you get ahead? Where does the diplomatic breakthrough come when you're constantly talking about Lenin and Stalin and Ukrainians' lack of gratitude for Russia's innovations and contributions?
Yeah, well, I think the Ukrainian response is we're not very grateful for Holodomor in the 30s or Chernobyl in the 80s. We can do just well without those Russian contributions. Thank you very much. I want to go back to another aspect of the history question, history as cause for conflict, and ask you: do you think that the Russians and Chinese have settled their history, their contested borders? You talk about Chinese feeling a sense of humiliation at their treatment by Western powers. At one point, Russia was one of those Western powers, and unlike most Western powers, seized significant bits of territory from China back in the day.
Right.
So does that have any prospect for causing friction or splits between Russia and China?
Indeed, and when the Sino-Soviet dispute unraveled, speaking of history, it unraveled in stages. Eventually, it was sort of muzzled in the beginning, but eventually it becomes more public, and other actors are tied up in it. Albania, Yugoslavia, etc. It's what a history it was. History is not forgotten, but it's suppressed. And I think with the friendship treaty and the post-Cold War friendship treaty of China and Russia, that kind of symbolizes these things, that they put a lot to bed, because as they see it, they have a bigger challenge, if you will. And when we talk about alliances, there's NATO, and increasingly NATO has been engaged, obviously Middle East and even Far East, but this AUKUS alliance, this really has drawn the ire of China and Russia. And so from their corner, or their respective corners, that their history is a small thing. And particularly the concerns and suspicions and inequities in their own history is a small thing compared to this, sort of growing, sort of coming together of particularly of a Eastern anchored alliance, Western alliance, if you will. And they both are really concerned with Australia becoming part of a security nexus, that ties in the U.S. and the West.
Okay. Well, we have roughly 10 minutes left for questions. Again, I would encourage you, if you want to ask a question to Dr. Hall, please do send it in to Kennan Institute on Twitter, via Facebook, and our email address is kennaninstitute@wilsoncenter.org. So I'm going to ask a question. This comes from Kieran Johnson. What do you think the implications might be if Sweden and/or Finland were to join NATO in the aftermath or with the proximate cause of Russia's aggression in NATO, in Ukraine, rather?
Sure. Interesting. I watched the Finnish president over the weekend interviewed, and he was asked that question among other types of questions. He acknowledged that that discussion is going on in this country in governmental circles there, and that essentially he wouldn't commit. He acknowledged the discussion, and that clearly, if an invasion were to happen, this was a few days ago, that clearly that discussion is going to be ramped up. You look at the moves that we think we could see or expect on either side, that's Russia's side and the Western side, that obviously I think it becomes a question of if NATO is enlarged or starts the process of pulling in a Sweden, a Finland, et cetera, well, then how does Russia counter that? And obviously it can reposition its conventional forces, but I think back to the Cold War, and that particularly intermediate range nuclear weapons could sort of come back into the equation, and many thought this was a huge achievement of INF, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Of course, we don't have that anymore. But if things are going to unravel and spiral, then at a point, the nuclear card is played, if you will, to antagonize those in Europe who might want to go deeper with NATO or join. That's what I see. But obviously, there are many more things that can be done on the conventional side to antagonize and to terrify those who would want to join NATO. But we cannot rule it out. And clearly, the Finnish president did not rule out at least having a discussion, a fuller discussion about it.
In your view, Greg, do you think that there's any chance that modern sort of strategic considerations like renegotiating INF or conventional arms treaties or any of these sort of traditional arms control security provisions that traditionally links the United States, the West, with Russia, the Soviet Union throughout history, any chance of that kind of logic prevailing over sort of the sense of historical grievance that Putin is just not even hiding anymore? He's just sort of shouting it from the rooftops, shouting it from a closed-in presidential office suite to the Russian people. Any chance that he could sort of start to favor the traditional calculation over sort of the historical grievance, or is it really we have to let this whole tragedy play out as best we can and just prevent as much as we can escalation of conflict to conflict?
Yeah, I really would welcome perspective from Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, particularly on this particular question. I will say that
I think she's working on that right now.
Yeah, she's working on that right now. Yeah. So much has happened in just the past few days, that really takes us into a level of instability and unpredictability in this crisis where I think the immediacy of it all requires a slight confidence building measures that speak to the situation. And so really we call them baby steps. And that's where we are here. And that, you know, and until there can be different narratives, if you will, or a discourse where out of the West, whatever, you know, the so-called concerns or grievance, security concerns that the White House says that we know Putin has these concerns. We want to talk about them. We want to engage. That becomes more of the discourse, and from Putin's side, less of the history in that regard. And again, if it's true that these nuclear drills, and these were strategic weaponry, these strategic drills, that the date was changed to coincide with this situation, that's a important message from Russia's side, and that we need to consider and grapple with. So I think we're to the point where how do we get through today, tomorrow, and then we build out and begin to encourage discourse. In my upcoming book, I even toss around the idea that the governments should embrace and encourage track 2 talks. Put it together in the private realm and test and board these things out in that way, and then draw from them. But yeah, we're at a really dire point.
Okay, well, I think we'll bring our conversation today at a close on a dire point, but also the hopes of finding ways of mutually communicating, including track 2. I do definitely endorse that. And it's something that worked in the Cold War and hopefully could work in today's conflict. So I want to thank our audience today for joining us, and I'd like to thank our speaker, Dr. Gregory Hall. And I'd also finally like to thank the Department of World Languages and Cultures at Howard University for co-sponsoring today's event, presented as part of Kennan Institute's Black History Month programming. This is very much history in the making, what we're going through today. And it's folks like Dr. Hall and Bonnie Jenkins, who is working at the State Department, was to join us today, but as you can imagine, was forced to bow out, giving an unfolding event. I want to encourage our audience who's very interested in how this crisis is unfolding to search for, find, and follow our Hindsight Upfront Ukraine page at the Wilson Center. There's lots of written video and event analysis there, all at one spot, and it's a very useful benchmark. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again at future events. And thank you, Dr. Gregory Hall, finally in conclusion.
Thank you, Joe and colleagues.